My presentation tonight is going to be what you need to know about COVID. Now, we lived a whole year of COVID, but there's a lot of information out there that we aren't being given. So we're going to go over a lot of that, not all of it. There's an immense amount of information that is kind of being withheld, hidden, censored, ignored. And so I'm going to try to go over the uncensored fine print. And so let's see, a little bit about me. Again, I have a degree at Bachelor of Science in Environmental Toxicology. I interned at the California EPA under the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And then when I had my first child, I began investigating the published medical research on vaccines and their associated infections. Eventually, I ended up creating a website called Vaccine Guide. And it's just basically a compilation of all kinds of different research, published medical research, information from the CDC, the FDA, the HHS, from the vaccine manufacturers themselves. Basically all information that we're not readily being given by the news media or by our doctors, nurses, etc. And so since then, I've worked with some nonprofit organizations. I've worked with Health Freedom Idaho, of course, different advocacy groups, helping them with information, and also with some law firms and legal teams. But what I really think is important when it comes to a person and their ability to judge information, not necessarily your experience, not necessarily your degrees. How do you come to conclusions? For me, I like to wait and observe, listen to different various perspectives, then check the data, not just the headlines. We're in a culture where it's just headline after headline after headline. And oftentimes, the information in the article doesn't really match what the headline's stating. Same with the studies. So, and then you have to look at how was that data collected and analyzed? Because sometimes the way that it's collected can affect what the outcome of the data is, can affect the results, it can affect the conclusions. And again, so are the conclusions based on sound reasoning and logic? Is there a conflict of interest? You know, we talk about conflicts of interest in politics often, but we kind of forget that there are conflicts of interest in science as well. And ultimately, does it make sense? You know, just all this information that I'm looking at, does it make sense? Does it sound right to me? Does it come together to form a clear picture of something that's logical? So we're going to go right into it, and we're going to look at the official numbers. As of July 4th, the CDC states that there have been I need to type. There have been 33,530,880 cases. Now, what they don't tend to include is that there have been 32,927,862 individuals who have recovered and or survived COVID. And there have been 603,018 deaths. So when you do the math there, it's a 98.3 survival rate and a 1.7 case fatality rate. So if you haven't heard of case fatality rate, it's just how many of the individuals who actually had COVID died. With the percentage, let's say. Okay, next slide. So when I said the uncensored fine print is what I want to look at, when you think of fine print, you usually think of, you know, when you sign a contract. But we kind of fail to realize that there's fine print everywhere. It's in politics, it's in science, it's in the media. Fine print is less noticeable print. It's usually accompanying something that's being advertised or information that people want you to know about, right? The larger print that's often used in conjunction with the fine print tends to have the effect of deceiving the consumer into believing the offer is more advantageous than it really is. But there is strong evidence that suggests the fine print is not read by the majority of consumers. Fine print may actually even say the opposite of what larger print says. Now, I don't usually use Wikipedia as a source, but that's what Wikipedia says. So how was the data collected? those numbers that we just looked at. We're going to look at the fine print. So let's look at COVID case counts. COVID case counts were either probable or confirmed. Both were counted amongst the overall case count. So you have confirmed cases. Those are cases which required a positive PCR test. You actually had to be tested to say you had COVID. That was a confirmed test and a confirmed case. However, there are probable cases. Probable cases require at least 2 minor symptoms or 1 major symptom of COVID. For example, 2 minor symptoms might be a headache and a sore throat, and a major symptom would be a cough. Now, any mild cold or flu would basically satisfy these requirements. For a probable case, you need either one of those, and you have to live in an area where COVID is considered endemic with ongoing community transmission. At this point, that's everywhere, okay? This was the case, this is what the CDC decided would be acceptable to include amongst the case counts in April 2020. They did update it in August 2020, and so the second part of this is slightly different. You have to be exposed to another probable case within the past 2 weeks in close proximity, and I'll go over that a little bit. Now, on May 18th, next slide, in Collin County, Texas, there was a commissioners meeting, and it was really illuminating. It was absolutely really fascinating. And just wanted to read some of these quotes here. They were discussing this new case definition of a probable case definition for COVID that would be included amongst all the case counts. They say what's remarkable is right now, all of Texas is considered an endemic region, so all of the residents satisfy that close contact condition. Now they only have to satisfy one of the other two. So if anyone has 2 minor symptoms, like fever, headaches, sore throat, chills, and fever, by the way, could either be measured fever or subjective fever. You could just feel like you have a fever, and that would be considered a fever. And now you meet the qualifications of a probable COVID patient. You could call your doctor, you could call the clinic, say you have these symptoms, you would be considered a probable case. They even said, it is remarkable how low the standard is now. I don't think it can be overstated here how much this can be taken out of context and could be given a false narrative to our citizens and our community. Also, they said there's no guarantee that even if the state keeps these numbers separate, confirmed and probable, that the media will. There's so many opportunities for there to be bad information provided. So, and again, I stated, next slide, that the CDC clarified the case definition in August, that basically you have to have close contact with a confirmed or probable case within the past 14 days, rather than just live in, any state. But again, the definition of close contact is subject to interpretation. It really just depends on the person evaluating your case. So this was actually a New York Times article. Your coronavirus test is positive, maybe it shouldn't be. The usual diagnostic tests may simply be too sensitive and too slow to contain the spread of the virus. So let's look at the test, the PCR test. How does it work? In a PCR test, your sample is amplified in cycles in order to detect viral genetic material. If the test identifies bits or pieces of viral genetic material, your sample is considered to be positive. But it really depends on the number of times your sample was amplified. The number of times your sample was amplified in order to detect viral genetic material is called the cycle threshold. It's kind of technical, but any test should be interpreted with how many times your sample was amplified, what the cycle threshold should be, or what the cycle threshold was. So the problem is that the tests can't just detect the live virus, but they can also detect genetic fragments left over from infections with other viruses, which currently pose no risk to you or anyone else. Manufacturers of these tests set their tests at various cycle thresholds. So there's all different labs around the US, all different manufacturers making these PCR tests, and they all have different cycle thresholds. However, the cycle threshold in the US is typically set at 40 cycles. Okay, now we're going to look at that. With a cycle threshold of 35 or higher, a positive test is actually a false positive 97% of the time. Okay, so 3% of the time, that positive test is accurate, but 97% of the time, it's just a false positive. And again, that's at 35 cycles. The US was overall setting it at 40 cycles when it came to the labs. Unfortunately, the cycle threshold is never included in results sent to doctors or patients, and the CDC has not set a standard cycle threshold. Does that seem a little crazy? Now, even the World Health Organization has actually issued some guidance on this, but they waited until December and January to start making people aware that they should be cautious to make sure they set the cycle threshold at a certain level. Okay, interesting that they decided to wait until then, when the vaccines were introduced. So, they state the cycle threshold needed to detect the virus is inversely proportional to the patient's viral load. High cycle threshold, low viral load. Where test results do not correspond with the clinical presentation, a new specimen should be retaken and retested. Wow, that sounds pretty, common sense. They say a useful assessment is the sensitivity of a test in patients with a PCR cycle threshold below 28 or 30. Because the virus is expected to be abundant in those samples, and when the test is in this range, it's correspondingly highly sensitive, okay? So even the World Health Organization is saying set the cycle threshold at 28 or 30, so you don't get false positives. So here we have the overall validity of the PCR test in question, okay? We have the CDC, all states, they kind of get to set their own rules and standards in general, but the CDC was giving the guidance that you can include probable cases based on these requirements amongst your overall case count. You have the PCR test that was giving out who knows how many false positives while actually being tested, and those people are being considered confirmed positive tests, cases. Unfortunately, we, the public, have no way of knowing because, again, the labs and testing facilities will not disclose this information. If you try to call a lab, they won't tell you. And again, the CDC has not issued guidance on what to set the cycle threshold at. And, because of this, we are seeing COVID positive foods and animals, okay? So the Tanzania President John, I don't want to say his last name, I'm just going to butcher it. The president actually decided he was going to test a papaya and a goat, and they both were positive, okay? Last year. Also, a sample of frozen chicken wings imported from Brazil tested positive for COVID. So when you see this graph, next slide, please, thanks. What does that really reflect? We knew we had tons and tons of people getting tested over and over again. Really what they reflect, next slide please, is that basically the number of samples, the number of people who tested. If we all went out and tested for the flu tomorrow, well, we'd have, a flu pandemic on our hands pretty quick. So, and it also, includes the number of people who informed their doctor or clinic of the symptoms they had. And again, maybe they had a cold, maybe they had the flu. They could have had any number of common cold-like or influenza-like illnesses. So we have COVID, which kind of also is known as being asymptomatic, having no symptoms of illness or disease, because many people tested who had no symptoms. and their test came back positive. And so you have all these reports of, oh, well, 40% of people are asymptomatic. You know, you really have to question what's going on there. Are they really testing positive? We don't know. So it could be cold virus, it could be influenza or other viruses or pneumonia, or maybe true COVID, yeah. It's a unique type of disease, a unique type of respiratory illness. But, you know, you blur the lines so much between influenza and colds and pneumonia and bronchitis and all of these other infections and illnesses, and they all become COVID in a way. So, the next thing, deaths. We're going to investigate the excess deaths. And I'm sure you've heard about the excess deaths from the media. And there were, based on the actual data, the official numbers, the increase in deaths in 2020 was quite alarming and upsetting. So, previous years, you range between 0.5 to 2.5%, 3%. The increase in the deaths in 2020 was 15%. It's a lot of people dying. And that's kind of a hard number to fudge when it comes to just numbers. You know what I'm saying? So we're going to break this down, COVID deaths by age. 57% of COVID deaths occurred in those aged 75 years or older. 22% were between the ages of 65 and 74. 16% were between 50 and 64 years. 3% were in those who were aged 40 to 49. 1%, 30 to 39. 0.4%, 18 to 29. And 0.05% were 0 to 17-year-olds. Kind of gives you a good perspective on what's happening here, right? So we have all these deaths. What's kind of precipitating this? And what's really happening here? Well, chronic disease in the U.S. is, it's growing. It's steadily increased over the years. And according to the CDC in 2008, which is now, long ago, but it's still increasing, 78% of adults age 55 and older had at least one chronic condition. Among adults age 65 or older, the prevalence of multiple chronic conditions in 2014 was 62%. And a study on 2018 data found that for adults aged 65 or older, the prevalence of multiple chronic conditions was highest among adults with both Medicare and Medicaid, 77%. We spend a lot of money on health care in this country, but we're getting sicker. So then you have, mental illness in the U.S. As of 2019, over 20% of adults in the U.S. live with a mental illness, ranging from mild to severe. And 5.2% of U.S. adults live with a serious mental illness. So what do we do? Next slide, please. We're going to lock you down. We're going to cancel your appointments. Next slide, please. Thanks. Your appointment's been canceled, okay? All elective surgeries, non-essential medical, surgical, dental procedures were delayed. And elective surgeries, it might sound, not that important. No, they are important procedures. Most of them, they are something you might be able to schedule in advance, but they do include serious conditions like hernia surgery, removing kidney stones, or an appendix, hip replacements, breast cancer surgery like a mastectomy. Things that are actually very critical to address were being considered elective surgeries that could be delayed. And also preventative screenings were suspended. And now your livelihood has been canceled too, okay? Were you considered non-essential to your government this past year? Is the ability to work and provide for yourself and your family not considered essential? We had 200,000 businesses that were permanently closed as a result of the economic shutdown. And your social life has been canceled. Hey, don't gather, keep your distance, stay away from your family and your friends. avoid handshakes, hugs, and all in-person socialization. And all of these things are really critical to health. And last but not least, stay inside, avoid sunlight and fresh air. Your body is a weapon and a ticking time bomb. There is no treatment for this. So when you look at even just staying inside and staying away from others and what that can do to your body and your mental health, your physical health, it prevented people from going to parks, going to beaches. They were cooped up in congested living environments. In New York, 2/3 of new hospital admissions were infected at home while sheltering in place. Prolonged exposure in enclosed environments is actually high risk. In outdoor settings, the risk is under 5%. So they told everybody to go inside and get sick, basically. The unrelenting cortisol, your primary stress hormone, suppresses your immune system by reducing the number of virus-fighting cells that you have. And so what does the media do? Non-stop COVID, non-stop fear and death and worry and stress. And then another thing happened. The government started sending COVID-positive patients, or just sick patients in general, people who had the flu, maybe influenza and other, infectious diseases, to nursing homes. They say to protect the hospital system, patients were discharged into care in nursing homes to a deadly effect. About half of America's COVID-19 deceased were in nursing home residents. Half were in nursing homes. Compared with hospitals, nursing homes suffer from inadequate training, lack of PPE and medical supplies, not enough carers, no rigorous separation and physical distancing of infected from other residents. During the pandemic, Governor Cuomo of New York required nursing homes to accept COVID-positive patients, and then he hid the data about the deaths of nursing home residents in his state. Governors of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan also required nursing homes to accept COVID-positive patients, putting their most vulnerable population at greatest risk. We saw 57% of the deaths were in people who were 75 and older. In addition to that, there was little to no accountability or protections. During the pandemic, the federal government waived many long-standing resident protections and facility reporting requirements. Accountability and oversight were severely limited. All standard and complaint surveys were basically waived. And people were barred from having long-term care legal representatives and families visiting them. New Mexico designated a coronavirus-only facility, which was a 1-star facility. It was cited for a, quote, complete lack of infection control, massive staff shortages, and staff incompetence. That facility was eligible for payments of $600 per patient per day, in addition to Medicare payments for the residents. $600 per patient per day. So when you look at the death rate among the states, New York and New Jersey have the highest COVID death rate, 2 of the states that forced nursing homes to accept COVID patients. Pennsylvania and Michigan, the other 2, took the 11th and 12th spots. And Massachusetts was one that actually financially incentivized nursing homes to take COVID patients, and Massachusetts came in at number 3. So ultimately, surviving the virus, this New York Times article states surviving the virus might come down to which hospital admits you. In New York City's poor neighborhoods, there were really high death counts. Now, if you haven't heard, there was actually a nurse who lived in Florida who was treating patients in Florida with things like hydroxychloroquine and having success. She ended up deciding to go to New York, work in the hardest hit area, see what was going on, and try to help. Ultimately, she was fired for advocating for her patients because she was witnessing fraud, negligence, and greed leading to unnecessary deaths. Excuse me. She has actually called for a federal investigation into the care at Elmhurst Hospital where she worked. Erin, the nurse, claims the hospital was not following proper cleaning protocols, residents weren't wearing personal protective equipment properly, and patients were being given wrong medications. In addition, COVID-negative patients who were admitted to the hospital for unrelated conditions, like for a stroke, let's say, were placed with COVID-positive patients where they would quickly and easily contract COVID. In an interview, she describes how patients were unnecessarily placed on ventilators, suffered from botched procedures, and how hospitals can get away with fraud when billing Medicare and Medicaid. So we have hospital-acquired COVID. That rate worldwide is between 12 to 15%. So people just going into the hospital for something completely unrelated, you have a 12 to 15% chance of contracting COVID from the hospital while in the hospital. Now, of course, because of what we learned about PCR tests and probable cases, how many of those are actual COVID? How many of those are something else? It's hard to say. But let's look at how hospitals actually treated COVID, okay? They were given remdesivir, immunosuppressants. They were put on ventilators. A lot of people were put on ventilators when they didn't need ventilators. And in order to be on a ventilator, you have to be given sedatives, neuromuscular blocking agents, basically paralyze you, opioids. We got done hearing about the opioid epidemic a couple years ago, and they're giving out COVID patients opioids in the hospitals as standard procedure. So, and let's look at the ventilators. Again, like I said, when you're on a ventilator, they have to give you paralyzing drugs, so you don't want to fight this ventilator. They have to give you sedatives. They have to keep you immobile. And we started hearing about blood clots last year and how scary it was that the COVID patients were developing blood clots. Well, I'm sure that there were cases of patients developing blood clots while not on ventilators, but ventilators themselves are basically increase your risk of developing a blood clot. So are paralyzing drugs, sedatives, and keeping you immobile. This is in the published medical research. It's well known. Not only are you at risk of pulmonary embolism, deep clot, or a lung clot, you're at risk of the deep vein thrombosis, which is typically in the legs. And there have been medical professionals and people like Erin who have admitted that ventilators are overused or were overused and often make patients worse. So I have to read this because it's a little horrific, but I actually screenshotted this post myself. This post was made by a COVID ICU nurse. And what's interesting is that the reason why this individual posted this was because he was trying to say you need to wear a mask so this doesn't happen to you and other people you love, okay? He says, in the COVID ICU, we use medications to completely paralyze your muscles so we can control every aspect of your breathing. So now you're paralyzed, but we don't want you paralyzed while alert and awake. That would be inhumane. So we add at least 2 sedation medications. One is usually propofol, the one linked to Michael Jackson's death. And the other is fentanyl, the one linked to so many opioid overdose deaths. Of note, all of these medications don't usually go on an IV. They usually do, but not on your arm like they would do in the emergency room. We put IVs right into your jugular. But hey, all this sedation also lowers your blood pressure, and you need an adequate pressure for your blood to reach your vital organs, like your kidneys. You don't want kidney failure. So now you're on another medication to keep your blood pressure up. But being on all these medications while completely unable to move and with a tube down your throat, where do you get your nutrition from? Are you okay, sir? you need help.
Oh, wait. Let's organize this.
Okay. I'll take a pause here. Okay. Okay, I think maybe we could keep going. I want to be insensitive here. Okay.
Go ahead and go back to your.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure you're okay.
But I am a noisy face.
Okay. Okay, so where was I? You have all these medications while completely unable to move and with a tube down your throat. Where do you get your nutrition from? So we put another tube down into your stomach. We put another tube into your urethra to make sure you're urinating. Meanwhile, your muscles are wasting away from being paralyzed. You're at an insanely high risk of infection because of all these tubes and IVs in places where they don't belong. Your skin can break down due to prolonged contact pressure from being paralyzed, and you can develop heart rhythm irregularities as side effects of these medications, which now puts you at an increased risk of cardiac arrest and dying. So the irony of them posting this, I mean, just to read that and think, this is how they save you? This is how they're supposed to save my life if I have COVID? It's a little overwhelming. So, and I want to talk about remdesivir just quickly. Remdesivir was not held to the same standards as other potential treatments and drug candidates. It's basically a kind of wide, what is it called? It's an antiviral, okay? It was given FDA approval based on promising data from small clinical trials. But ultimately, the published data found that remdesivir had little or no effect on mortality, on the need for ventilation, or duration of hospital stay. But it did cost $2,600 per treatment. Now, you know, I'm big into taking charge of your health, keeping yourself healthy, nutrition, and all of that. I've done a lot of research on different things. When COVID first came around, I wanted to know how to treat it. I wanted to know what I would do if I, myself, my parents, my family contracted COVID. So I did my research. And there's a lot of published medical research on different supplements, supplemental therapies that you could be taking that would help tremendously. But these are censored or ignored. I'm sure you've heard of ivermectin. There's budesonide, if you haven't heard of that. It's basically a steroid for your lungs that you can inhale that will help you breathe. There's N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, zinc, quercetin, vitamin C, thiamine. And these are all the different sources that I've compiled. There are a lot more to support using those therapies for COVID, to support your health, to make sure that you can get through it, to make sure you don't have to go to the hospital. And when it comes to things like glutathione, NAC, those things that I mentioned, there's studies showing that COVID patients that are severe COVID, that they're low in glutathione anyway. They're low in thiamine. They need more zinc. Your body needs more vitamin C when you have an infection. To not give something that's basically a vitamin or an amino acid or something that is naturally found in fruits and vegetables, and rather, you know, using something like remdesivir that costs nearly $3,000 per treatment, well, you start to realize that the medical system's not really about health. So next slide. So this was an article published in USA Today on April 25th, 2020. It says 1 in 3 death certificates were wrong before COVID. It's about to get even worse. And it's true, it did get worse. A review of Missouri hospitals in 2017 found nearly half of death certificates listed an incorrect cause of death. A Vermont study found 51% had major errors. Inaccurate reporting on death certificates is systemic. Almost half of New York City physician residents who were surveyed and 58.4% of high-volume respondents, other physicians, admitted that they knowingly reported an inaccurate cause of death on a death certificate. Of those who reported an inaccurate cause, almost 77% said that the system would not accept the correct cause. 40% admitted that office personnel instructed them to, quote, put something else. And almost 31% said that the medical examiner instructed them to do so. The system is totally broken. How do we know what people are dying of? So much policy, so much legislation, so many decisions are based on this data. Next slide, please. Thanks. So, when it comes to investigations and autopsies into deaths, in the state of California, doctors are expected to provide a cause of death within 15 hours of someone dying. Autopsies are highly important for finding misdiagnoses. However, only 4 to 8% of deaths are actually investigated by autopsy. Now, a colleague of mine is she was a death certificate clerk for 7 years. And she admitted that causes of death on death certificates are just medical opinion. They're not scientific or objective fact. They're just opinions. What else happened in 2020? We had a 10 to 27% increase in domestic violence calls and arrests. According to data published by the City of Philadelphia, the number of shooting victims increased by 7% during the period of April 1st to the April 15th. Just that one, basically, 2 weeks compared to the same time the previous year. From November 2019, oh, thank you, I'm needing a little bit of water. Okay. From November 2019 to November 2020, drug overdose deaths in the U.S. jumped by 30%. On May 22nd, the head doctor of trauma at John Muir Medical Center in Walnut Creek, California, was reported to say that they've, quote, seen a year's worth of suicide attempts in the last 4 weeks. Yet, official statistics claim that suicides actually declined in 2020. It's a little odd, right? And what happened to the flu? You guys, what happened? I mean, most of you guys have heard about this, right? It's during the 2019 flu season from September 29th to December 28th, a 3-month period, 3 months, the CDC reported more than 65,000 cases of influenza nationwide in just those 3 months. During the same period, this past flu season in 2020, the agency reported 1,016 cases. Guess what it was being diagnosed as, guys? Now, what's not being reported on death certificates? Deaths due to medical errors. Recent studies of medical errors have estimated errors may account for as many as 251,000 deaths annually in the United States. Every year, just medical errors. However, the true number of premature deaths associated with preventable harm to patients may be more than 400,000 per year. A 2018 CNBC article states that studies on medical errors define a death due to medical error as one that is caused by inadequately skilled staff, error in judgment or care, a system defect, or a preventable adverse effect. This includes computer breakdowns, mix-ups with the doses or types of medications administered to patients, and surgical complications that go undiagnosed. Ordinary complications can occur, especially from unneeded medical care. According to him, 20% of all medical procedures may be unnecessary. and probably more when it comes to the people who aren't getting proper nutrition. Doctors have been encouraged by drug companies, sometimes through cash payments, to promote their products. Currently, the CDC uses a deaths collection system that only tallies causes of death occurring from diseases, morbid conditions, and injuries. Not drugs, not vaccines, not medical errors. So is there an incentive? Last year in April, there were some doctors who got together to do a press conference. It was great. It was really helpful. I'm so glad they did it. They were censored heavily. Well, what they came to say was that their colleagues in hospitals, other doctors, were being pressured to list COVID-19 on death certificates. Illinois' top health official explained that any victim diagnosed with the novel coronavirus would be classified as a COVID-19 death, regardless of whether it contributed to the patient's death. If you die of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. When a reporter asked who was applying the alleged pressure on the physicians when it came to, labeling it as COVID, he said it was hospital administration. On April 8, 2020, Senator and physician Scott Jensen from Minnesota made headlines when he stated that hospitals get paid more if Medicare patients are listed as having COVID-19 and get 3 times as much money if they need a ventilator. Hospital administrators might well want to see COVID-19 attached to a discharge summary or death certificate. Why? Because it's a straightforward garden variety pneumonia that a person is admitted, I'm going too fast. If it's just a regular old pneumonia that someone's admitted for, if they have Medicare, typically the diagnosis would be a lump sum payment of $5,000. But if it's COVID-19, then it's $13,000. And if that COVID-19 patient ends up on a ventilator, goes up to $39,000. Now, USA Today, there's a lot of people who tried to debunk this or claim that this was false. USA Today even said, actually, that's true. So what's the Provider Relief Fund? The Provider Relief Fund supports healthcare providers in the battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. Through the CARES Act, the federal government allocated $178 billion in payments to be distributed through the Provider Relief Fund. Next slide, please. So essentially, they incentivized COVID cases and deaths through this Provider Relief Fund, if it wasn't already blatantly obvious. A provider is eligible to receive Provider Relief Fund payments, so as long as they provided on or after January 31st, 2020, diagnoses, testing, or care for individuals with possible or actual cases of COVID-19. And the Department of Health and Human Services broadly views every patient as being a possible case of COVID-19, so it doesn't have to be specific to treating COVID-19. They could be treating all other kinds of things, but it's a COVID patient, so. And these distributions do not have to be repaid. They're not loans. It's free money. And the nursing homes got this money too. During the coronavirus pandemic, nursing homes have received billions of additional dollars from government to reimburse for care through the Medicare and Medicaid programs. The federal government has given hundreds of millions of additional dollars through multiple programs, and most of these federal payments have been made without regard to facilities' performance. Many states have also increased Medicaid rates across the board or paid higher rates for COVID-19 positive residents or established COVID-19 only facilities and paid them high rates, just like New Mexico. By creating a massive federal program that links large Medicare payments to COVID-19 treatments, the feds incentivize hospitals to add COVID-19 to diagnostic lists and death certificates. It also incentivized hospitals to get patients on ventilators, which may have done more harm than good, as hospitals have reported unusually high fatality rates for COVID-19 patients on ventilators. We aren't pressured to test for the flu, Dr. Erickson said. Why are we being pressured to add COVID? So I thought these few were kind of funny, but also terrible if you're the person that this happened to, or the family members. So in one case, a death certificate of a 79-year-old South Carolina woman with Alzheimer's who had no COVID symptoms and was never tested for COVID stated she died of COVID complications. The death certificate of a man who suffered a stroke after being diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer and tested negative for COVID repeatedly stated he died of COVID. And a Florida man in his 20s who was killed in a motorcycle accident was actually reported to have COVID, and that's what killed him. On his death certificate, it said COVID, even though he died in a motorcycle accident. Now, all of these three were news articles that I found. Most of these cases were censored. Most of them were eliminated from the internet. There were, last year, I came across hundreds of testimonies from people where their family members were listed as having COVID at the time of their death and dying of COVID when they really did not die of COVID. Now, obviously, you have to take my word on that because I don't have them anymore to show you. So now we're going to move on to the vaccine. Okay. You've probably heard of emergency use authorization. According to the FDA may authorize unapproved medical products to be used in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions caused by chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threat agents when certain criteria are met, including there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. So they cannot give EUA, emergency use authorization, if there are adequate or approved or available alternatives to treat COVID. So that kind of makes sense now why there were so many legitimate potential treatments that were completely ignored, completely censored. On February 4th, 2020, well before most Americans were even aware of the existence of COVID, the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary declared that circumstances exist justifying the authorization of emergency use of drugs and biological products during the COVID-19 pandemic. February 4th. Who even heard of COVID at that point in the US? So now you have the PrEP Act, which was also invoked on February 4th, 2020. The PrEP Act is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which basically provides immunity from liability for any injuries, any deaths that arise from whatever they're trying to do to protect you from COVID, which includes the vaccine. So yes, in other words, COVID vaccine manufacturers, next slide, are not liable for any loss of health or life as a result of administering their product in order to fight COVID. And if you don't believe me, this was a CNBC article. You can't sue Pfizer or Moderna if you have severe COVID vaccine side effects. The government likely won't compensate you for damages either. So you have no legal recourse. If you get the vaccine and you experience severe side effects after getting the vaccine, lawyers tell CNBC there is basically no one to blame in a U.S. court of law. The federal government has granted companies like Pfizer and Moderna immunity from liability if something unintentionally goes wrong with their vaccines. You also can't sue the FDA for authorizing a vaccine for emergency use, nor can you hold your employer accountable if they mandate it as a condition of employment. So let's look at the long-term safety data and effectiveness data of this vaccine. The Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, also known as Janssen, were given emergency use authorization in December 2020. Pfizer and Moderna were. Johnson & Johnson was given it in March. But they were given emergency use authorization after providing just 2 months' worth of phase 3 clinical trial data to the FDA. Just 2 months' worth, okay? Human trials. Subjects in the clinical trials who originally received placebo were unblinded shortly thereafter in around February 2020, leaving no comparison group for ongoing study. So the whole point of a double-blind placebo study is to give one group the placebo, one group the vaccine. You're not supposed to tell them what they got, and you're supposed to be able to compare the outcomes, whether or not they got COVID, whether or not they got sick, chronic illnesses, whether or not they died. Can't do that anymore. There is no placebo group or control group anymore, except that some people did get saline in their shots. I don't know if you've seen that, but there are people in the US who accidentally got saline. So who knows if they're actually still doing their trial, because the adult phase 3 clinical trials are still in progress and won't conclude until 2022, 2023. Okay, so everybody that's gotten the vaccine is a part of the clinical trial at this point. And, again, that was originally based on 2 months worth of data. The quickest vaccine ever developed was for mumps, and it took 4 years. So traditional vaccines, they use live or killed viruses and bacteria, plus an adjuvant like aluminum to provoke the immune system, plus other biological and chemical components. I'm not advocating for them, just saying that's what it is. mRNA vaccines are very different, very new. I find it interesting that they decided to start using brand new tech this year when we have this pandemic, when we have so many decades worth of experience with the traditional vaccines and they work so well, right? So why would we need new ones? Why would we need new tech? I don't have the answer to that. So the mRNA vaccines use genetic sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, the part of the virus that binds to your cells. The mRNA sequence is encapsulated in a lipid nanoparticle to preserve the sequence and prevent it from rapidly degrading in the body. Now, in some studies, it says the potential risks include local and systemic inflammatory responses, the biodistribution and persistence of the immune system expression in your body, possible development of autoreactive antibodies, so basically autoimmunity, and toxic effects of any non-native nucleotides and delivery system components. That's a lot. But ultimately, mRNA vaccines have never been used in humans previously. It's just brand new, and we're giving it to everybody. Okay? So what most people don't realize is, the spike protein itself, even though it's just a piece of the virus, and that's what's being used in these vaccines, the spike protein can actually cause harm in and of itself. So according to research published in October 2020, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein itself can cause inflammation and damage of the lungs, more specifically damage in human bronchial epithelial cells, the lining in between your lungs, or in your lungs between the air and your tissues. In addition, a study published in March 2021 found that the spike protein induces hypercoagulability, leading to the formation of amyloid deposits and blood clots. Other studies have suggested that spike protein may cross the blood-brain barrier as well. Now, a Pfizer study that I think it was leaked actually, because it's a confidential study, but it was performed in Japan regarding the mRNA lipid nanoparticle used in the formulation of their vaccine. And it sought to determine where in the body the lipid nanoparticle encapsulated mRNA may be deposited. So they used male and female rats that were sacrificed eventually, and they were given intramuscular injections of the solution and were studied over the course of 48 hours. Aside from the injection site where most of the lipid nanoparticle was deposited, of all organs and tissues measured, it was preferentially deposited in your liver, in your spleen, your adrenal glands, and female ovaries. So if you can look at the differences in the amounts there compared to it being detected in other tissues, it's a big difference there. So let's continue to look at Pfizer for a bit. In the FDA briefing document, the document that Pfizer provided to the FDA, covering all of the data on their phase 3 clinical trial in that 2-month period, right, the 2 months worth, they had a section on suspected cases. Now, of course, you didn't hear about this in the news media, and you didn't hear about this from your doctor or from the government, but they had a whole section on suspected cases. They considered a suspected case someone who had all the signs and symptoms of COVID, but did not have it confirmed by a PCR test. Pfizer claims their vaccine was 95% effective. However, this is a quote from that section. Suspected COVID-19 cases that occurred within 7 days after any vaccination were 409 in the vaccine group versus 287 in the placebo group. What that means is that over 70% of participants who developed what any doctor would have diagnosed as COVID in the first 7 days following each dose were those who received the vaccine. So the way they got away with this is that they didn't really count these cases. They only started counting cases 2 weeks after the second dose. So all of these cases that happened within the first 7 days following the first dose and the next 7 days after the second dose, they didn't have to include these cases. Okay, so let's look at something with the Moderna vaccine that we weren't really told about. From the briefing document that Moderna supplied to the FDA, there's a few things I thought were interesting here. They looked at, people who had developed serious adverse events after getting the vaccine, and that the investigator of the clinical trial had concluded was actually related to the vaccine. So we have a 46-year-old female here with hypothyroid and a possible sinus infection, and 24 days after the last dose developed autonomic dysfunction, which was unresolved. So again, if you look, it says that the investigator decided that this was related to the vaccine 24 days later, okay? So we're told that this can't happen. You can't have, an adverse event or develop an injury that long after getting the vaccine, but the investigator says you can. What's funny is the Moderna says no. Nope, it wasn't our vaccine. And again, there's two others here that one had a history of lung cancer and developed B-cell lymphocytic lymphoma 31 days after her last dose, and then a male who developed rheumatoid arthritis 2 weeks later. But again, you're not going to hear about this in the news. All right. Now we have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a different type of vaccine. It's not mRNA, it's a vector-based vaccine, and it is made using genetically engineered adenovirus, completely different virus than SARS-CoV-2, and also genetically modified human retinal cells obtained from a fetus. And yes, that is true. That's factual. Previous attempts at adenoviral vector vaccines have been abandoned 3 and 4 years into clinical trials. There have never been viral vector vaccines used in humans previously. They just weren't working. Also, one thing I really wanted to note about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that, they try to say that their vaccine is highly effective. Well, when you look at where it's most important to be effective for the high-risk groups, the people who are like elderly or the people who have chronic illnesses, comorbidities, the effectiveness drops down to 42%, 23%, 35%. It's, you don't hear about that again. That's the fine print, but it's all there. It's all in the FDA briefing document. Now I want to look at pharmaceutical industry fraud. The pharmaceutical industry has a long history of criminal convictions for a wide variety of fraudulent actions. Most companies actually set aside millions or billions of dollars, knowing that they're going to be convicted of criminal offenses and need to pay out. And it's just the cost of doing business, because they make so much more promoting their products. They actually spend maybe 2 to 3 times more on advertising than they do on research and development for their drugs. So in 2009, Pfizer was ordered to pay $2.3 billion for fraud that they committed. And according to a study on Pfizer's criminal history, Pfizer has been a habitual offender, persistently engaging in illegal and corrupt marketing practices, bribing physicians, and here's my favorite, suppressing adverse trial results. Let's trust them. Johnson & Johnson has paid over $4.2 billion in penalties for various crimes since the year 2000, including false claims, drug or medical equipment safety violations, foreign corrupt practices, consumer protection violations, environmental violations, and more. Of note, in a 2013 press conference, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder at the time stated that Johnson & Johnson's practices, quote, recklessly put at risk the health of some of the most vulnerable members of our society, including young children, the elderly, and the disabled. And then you have Moderna. They're a pretty new company. But Moderna is even kind of, well, I'll just read it. An anti-corruption watchdog group is urging the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to investigate top executives at Moderna, the biotech firm developing a promising coronavirus vaccine, for allegedly manipulating the stock market. This misconduct was particularly egregious because it involved not only financial fraud and manipulation of the financial markets, but also because it exploited widespread fears surrounding the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. What they did was, when they came out with all this news saying their vaccine was great, it was effective, it's going to be wonderful, we're going to, not die of COVID anymore, they sold about $90 million worth of their company's stock in those following few days. And obviously their stock price went through the roof. So the vaccine market in general, before COVID, vaccines were a $60 billion per year worldwide industry and rising, projected to be $100 billion by 2025. But Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine revenue is projected to hit $26 billion in just 2021. Just that one vaccine for just that one company. Moderna expects $18.4 billion in COVID-19 vaccine sales in 2021. With a third dose, we'll see even more. And of course, the CDC and the FDA, they're regulatory agencies. They're supposed to be regulating the industry. They're supposed to be protecting the consumer, protecting the citizens, the people. However, senior scientists at the CDC have admitted that fraud in scientific research at the CDC has become the norm, and that the CDC is heavily influenced by industry interests. The FDA has been caught regularly burying details and evidence of scientific fraud and misconduct in clinical trials. And pharmaceutical companies pretty regularly financially compensate FDA advisors after their drugs are approved. Hey, thanks. Here's a little gift. So let's look at the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or otherwise known as VAERS. VAERS is managed by CDC and FDA and is intended to serve as an early warning system to detect safety concerns with U.S. licensed vaccines. VAERS is a passive system, meaning it relies on individuals and medical professionals to report vaccine adverse events and to know how and where to report them. Most people, though, have never heard of VAERS. Some doctors and nurses haven't even heard of VAERS. Anyone can report an event. However, you will need detailed information to do so properly. You usually need the lot number of the vaccine, dates when the vaccine was administered, when you had the injury, and so on. A lot of personal information. Now, a study funded by the Department of Health and Human Services actually found that fewer than 1% of all vaccine adverse events are reported to VAERS. Let me get some water here. Okay. And as of July 7th, there have been 438,440 reports of adverse events following COVID vaccines. So when you take that underreporting factor into account, the true number of adverse events for COVID vaccines may be up to 4,384,400. So let's look at some COVID vaccine VAERS reports. Because here's the thing, even the people who have heard of VAERS, it's hard to actually look through VAERS. It's not easy. I almost think they make it hard on purpose to search the database for the average person. For me, it was difficult, and it took me a while to really grasp how to use the tool. So we're going to look at a few because I think it's so important, so important for people to actually read adverse event reports from people, from doctors, from people who received the vaccine, from loved ones who watched their family members get the vaccine, and so on. Because there's a lot of people who, try to say, oh, well, VAERS isn't reliable. You can just report whatever you want there. If you read them, you can see they're from real people, okay? So here's where you have a 65 to 79-year-old person who received the Moderna vaccine, started getting sick 2 days after getting the shot. The description of the event is, on December 24th, the resident was sleepy and stayed in bed most of the shift. He stated he was doing okay, but requested pain medication for his legs at 2:50 p.m. At 2:55 a.m. on December 25th, the resident was observed in bed lying still, pale, eyes half open, and foam coming from mouth and unresponsive. He was not breathing and with no pulse. So here's a 50 to 59-year-old who received the Pfizer vaccine, who started feeling ill the same day as getting the shot. The description says, the patient had second vaccine, went home and started having cramping in all of her muscles. It became bad enough that she was taken to local emergency department, where she then started coughing up blood, required intubation, and about 6 hours later died. Here's one for the Janssen vaccine. Actually, 3 of them. For people aged 30 to 39 years. So the first one happened on the first day of having the shot. It says patient began having seizures about 4 hours post-vaccine while at a friend's house and passed away. The next one happened 1 day later, cardiac arrest, death approximately 12 hours later. 4 days later, for someone else, massive pulmonary thromboemboli, lung blood clot. These were in people aged 30 to 39. It was just really surprising. For the Pfizer vaccine, here's another few. For those aged 65 to 79 years old, it says, patient died in his sleep the night of getting dose 1 COVID-19. He had a massive heart attack and died. Second one, tiredness, death. March 19th, cause of death, ruptured myocardial infarction. It's a heart attack. The third one, approximately 30 minutes after the vaccination, the patient experienced a cardiac arrest. He was brought to the hospital where resuscitation efforts were continued, but ultimately proved to be unsuccessful. The patient was pronounced deceased. I only got 2 more of these, okay? So I know it's kind of a lot. This one was for the Moderna vaccine, an 80-plus-year-old individual. And this one's pretty illuminating. It says, my grandmother died a few hours after receiving the Moderna COVID vaccine booster 1. While I don't expect that the events are related, the treating hospital did not acknowledge this, and I wanted to be sure a report was made. They didn't acknowledge it. 3 hours later, person dies 3 hours after the shot, and it was not acknowledged. How many of these are just completely swept under the rug or ignored, or just people are clueless? This is the last one. It's for the Janssen vaccine for an age 60 to 64-year-old. Oh, it was a 63-year-old person, if I remember right. Okay, it says patient went to the ER with severe headache, inability to stay awake. The CT scan of the head revealed multiple areas of subarachnoid hemorrhage, unexplained, no head injury, and a very large ruptured aneurysm. Patient was completely asymptomatic prior to vaccination. The aneurysm was repaired with success, but the cerebral hemorrhages kept appearing unexplained Cerebral edema became so severe, neurosurgery ended up performing a craniotomy to relieve pressure as well as placement of a ventriculostomy. This patient later ended up with severe vasospasms, which results in an ischemic stroke in the front lobe. Patient later died in a rehabilitation facility, all of this secondary to the Janssen vaccine. This vaccine should not, This vaccine should not be administered until further studied. This was a healthy 63-year-old woman. Vitals always within normal, labs always within normal, very active, BMI, body mass index within normal limits. Absolutely no comorbidities, a lifelong nurse who raised 2 nurses of her own. These events took place for over a month. The trauma not only the patient has experienced, but her family is unforgivable. So, again, when it says that there are less than 1% of all the adverse events that are reported to VAERS, how many are not paying attention? You can clearly read in this report that the doctor knew this family. The doctor knew this person and wanted to advocate for them. How many people don't have a doctor like that or don't have a doctor that knows them, like that? The details here, when you read these details on the VAERS database in these reports, nothing else can replace reading those for yourself. And that's why I found it so important to just present a few of them here today. But we will move on. So if you were to look at all the deaths from the vaccine that were reported to VAERS, just the ones reported, right? If there was no relation to the vaccine, you would think that the number of deaths on the day of getting the vaccine, on the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, and so on, would be relatively the same. If the vaccine had no impact on death, it would be pretty level. 50 deaths on day 0, 50 deaths on day 1, 49 on day 2, you know what I'm saying? So, but here we have this curve. High numbers of deaths being reported on the day of getting the vaccine, on the next day, and they start to drop off a little bit. And what's interesting, and if you know anything about other vaccines, you know that around 2 to 3 weeks later is a typical time period when injuries begin to manifest and develop. You start to have symptoms from vaccines. Sometimes you can feel totally fine until 2 to 3 weeks later, and then you start having symptoms. And by then, most people don't connect it to the vaccines. But in the scientific literature, it's connected. Even months later, there are vaccines that can cause autoimmune disease. Months later, they've connected it. So, obviously, I just wanted to share this for your own benefit so that you can see that there's some kind of temporal relationship happening here. As of July 6th, VAERS received 5,946 reports of death following COVID vaccines. Now, if you want to calculate how many that would be, if if that's just 1% or less than 1%, it would be up to 594,000. Almost the 600,000 that we lost to COVID. Now this is not considering the long-term effects from the vaccines because we're really only, not very many months into this. And it's also not considering the potential for enhanced disease via antibody-dependent enhancement, if you've heard of that, upon re-exposure to the virus or new variants. Now, I didn't have time to get into other serious adverse events, but next slide, please. Oh, thanks. Sorry. But there are, a lot of reports for stroke, heart attack, blood clots, miscarriages, paralysis and palsies, sepsis, anaphylaxis, all kinds of reports in VAERS. Obviously, it depends on, what kind of internal weaknesses that you already have. Depends on your chronic conditions you might have, how old you are, genetic vulnerabilities, and so on. But there's a lot there as well. Now let's look at the variants. We're getting kind of near the end here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the variants because everybody's, talking about the variants these days. Typically, when you have any virus that starts to mutate and throw off different variants, what happens is they become more easily infectious, but less severe. That's kind of always been the natural way of viruses. So when you see in the news media that they're trying to say that it's more severe and people are dying quicker or faster or more easily, you might want to try to just block. You might want to try to just question it. Just question. So, there's one study, though, that was done on the South African variant. The South African variant infects twice vaccinated individuals nearly 8 times more than unvaccinated. That was a study that was done. But, you can only find that in one article. So if you don't know where to look for it, then, you're not going to hear about it. Another article states that 3 weeks after one dose, both the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccine saw a drop in effectiveness against symptomatic disease to roughly 33% against the India variant versus about 51% for the Kent variant. And then they try to say, well, after 2 doses, though, the effectiveness goes back up. But again, how are we documenting COVID? How are we testing for COVID? What is considered COVID? Could the vaccine be creating the variants? French Nobel laureate Luc Montagnier, who is considered an expert in virology, has recently stated that vaccinating people in a pandemic is going to be lethal, and that there was an association between rising vaccinations and death rates. He didn't explicitly say so, but he did say that vaccinations were an enormous mistake and that they were basically creating the variants. And now there is evidence that this is likely to occur. So vaccines can exert a type of pressure on viruses to mutate. So you're focused on one particular form of the virus in this vaccine. Now, viruses are tricky. They mutate. They like to make sure that they can infect us. And, when you think about it, when you have 99% or so of the people who contract the virus benefiting from the virus, having immunity from the virus, overall, this benefits the population. That is the ultimate, maybe the goal of a virus. But obviously, we have a population of people who are chronically ill, and they're going to be susceptible to that process. But from different scientific studies we have found, it says it's possible that novel vaccines that increase the potency of immunity to other viral proteins may lead to more rapid antigenic evolution. And again, our findings suggest that vaccine pressure works to select influenza variants genetically distant from vaccine strains, vaccine-related genetic drift, basically mutation. Evidence strongly supports the action of vaccine-induced immunity in conditioning viral evolution, potentially leading to the emergence of new vaccine escape variants. So, I wanted to touch on antibody-dependent enhancement. There's, back last year, there was a little more of this being published, a little more of this being covered, where they wanted to look at the antibodies. People were being careful about neutralizing antibodies and non-neutralizing antibodies. If you have a vaccine and you develop antibodies, you want them to be neutralizing. You want them to neutralize that virus. However, sometimes, and with all previous coronavirus vaccines, the animal trials for previous coronavirus vaccines found that they developed non-neutralizing antibodies, but they were only looking at antibodies, period. They made a lot of them. Oh, good, we've got antibodies. They were non-neutralizing. So what happens? You have this phenomenon where a previously vaccinated individual who has developed these non-neutralizing antibodies against a pathogen when they get subsequently exposed, the disease is actually much worse than it would have been. It's called disease enhancement. And even the FDA had listed this on their website as something they wanted to look for when it comes to the coronavirus vaccines. So here are some examples of the previous attempts at coronavirus vaccines. It says safety concerns with SARS-CoV-2 vaccines were initially fueled by mouse studies that showed enhanced immunopathology, enhanced respiratory disease. And this was in animals which were vaccinated following viral challenge, okay? In the animal studies that they did with coronavirus vaccines previously, they would vaccinate the animals, test them for antibodies, and then they would challenge them to the virus. They don't typically do this with vaccines, and they definitely don't do it with human trials. They don't challenge people with the virus because that would be unethical, right? So, but in 4 or 5 different studies, they tried to challenge mice that were vaccinated, but it led to hypersensitivity to SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-CoV. Okay, so there's SARS-CoV and SARS-CoV-2. Sorry, next one. And then you have, they looked at another study, another mice study, where they says vaccines not only failed to protect from the challenge of the virus, but resulted in enhanced immune pathology, lung damage. It says a double inactivated severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus vaccine in another study provides incomplete protection in mice and induces increased pro-inflammatory pulmonary response upon challenge. Okay, and another one said that it causes severe pneumonia in mice that were infected with SARS-CoV-2, the ones that were vaccinated. So, while you have antibody-dependent enhancement, which was discovered in these animal trials in previous coronavirus vaccine trials, like I said, they challenged the animals. They gave them the virus. There was no viral challenge in the COVID vaccine trials. Okay. So, really quick, based on the number of deaths, I just wanted to make this point when it comes to children. Okay. We're talking about vaccinating for children, all the kids being a part of the trials now. Based on the number of deaths in the ages 0 to 17 for COVID, a child living in the U.S. is over 5 times more likely to die of cancer than to die of COVID. And that's even when we're diagnosing everything as COVID. Okay? This should be a no-brainer. Children should not be taking this risk, period. The children should not have to take the risk for everybody else either. Okay? And finally, good news, mild COVID-19 induces lasting antibody protection. And if you haven't seen this, it says antibody-producing cells were found in people 11 months after first symptoms. These cells will live and produce antibodies for the rest of people's lives. That's strong evidence for a long-lasting immunity. If you think about how many people have already had COVID, I'm not sure it makes sense to keep vaccinating everybody for COVID. So anyway, that is that. I have some additional resources. I'm going to be putting this presentation on the internet, and hopefully, we'll be able to post that somewhere and be able to access it so you can get all of the links and share it with whoever you want to share it with. I hope it was really informative. I hope you learned something that you didn't already know. And thank you so much for being here.